Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kinza Ghaznavi, and I'm the new grants manager at AC. I have 10 years of federal grants experience ranging from programmatic to fiscal. My co-presenters today are going to be Michael Kenefick. He is a consultant with EAC who has been providing legal assistance and audit resolution to our grantees on and off since 2009. And Peg Rosenbery, who's our subject matter expert with grants at EAC, also for the past several years. Today, we are going to be discussing the CARES Act of 2020 and meeting its match requirements. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please hold your questions until the end and make sure to mute your lines if you are not speaking. We will request questions from those calling in. At that point, we will request that you unmute before you ask a question. And for now, we are going to turn off video until the questions. All right, so let's dive in. The CARES Act of 2020 provides funds for activities related to the pandemic in the 2020 federal election cycle. The act under the Consolidated Appropriations Act requires that there be a 20% match that grantees must meet within 2 years of receiving the funds. The definition of match is that portion of project costs not paid by federal funds. For the CARES Act, as I've said, there's an additional 20% of the federal funds spent that will be funded and spent by states. The source of match can be cash, which is state appropriations or other, subgrantees, or in by third parties. Match must be verifiable from grantee or subgrantee records, not included as contributions in other federal awards, not paid by the federal government under another federal award, and necessary, reasonable, and allowable, just like all other expenses under the cost principles.
Okay, on state match, one of the things that we wanted to note was that EAC doesn't require separate funding authority from the state, but we realize that many states do require separate funding authority, even if they're not getting an appropriation for match. Of course, they would need one for appropriation, but a lot of states, when they get grants and funds from the federal government, have to get a authority from the state for implementation, but it's not an EAC requirement. While you can get appropriated funds to meet match, some of the state match could also be met with allowable cost within the agency's existing budget authority. Match can be used for pre-award cost incurred on or after January 2020 during the period of the public health emergency. And this is per the OMB guidance that was put out, M-20-20. The type of matching cost that you might consider outside of appropriating the money would be staff working on issues impacted by the pandemic. If the staff are working on other HAVA grants and the pandemic grant, you need to be able to allocate time to each separately. Likewise, if they're working on non-grant election issues and grant activities, you also need to separate the time. This is usually done for states most appropriately through a timesheet, where perhaps you assign activity codes for their various projects that they're working on. The 2 CFR 200-430 paragraph contains the standards for documentation of personnel expenses. One of the things we note with new grantees not used to accounting for federal funds is you can't use the budget as a basis for your salary charges. For example, if you budget 20% of a staff member to work on this grant, you have to keep the actual time during their 2-week pay period, if that's their pay period, rather than just saying it's 20%. Okay, the next slide will be other matching cost, equipment, supplies, travel, etc. They must be expended for pandemic-related issues, cleaning, extra new voting machines, relocating polls, special barriers for protection of voters, poll workers, etc. And a number of these activities were put together in the first session that EAC had and were published about the various ideas that existed. If the costs are being charged to other HAVA grants and the pandemic grant, you again need to allocate these expenses to each separately by some appropriate allocation mechanism. You also need effective control and accountability for all your expenditures. That may involve somebody at the election office approving various charges to the grant. I think I'm going through the indirect cost. I did, we are going to change this slide slightly. It'll say state agency because I'm not aware of a state that has an overall indirect cost rate. Mostly it's their primary agencies have them and some of their smaller agencies. So if your state agency has a federally established indirect cost rate, you can apply that rate to both the direct federal and the direct state expenditures and claim it as a match. You also can claim matches, part of it as a match and part of it as direct expenses. It's whatever you're trying to achieve with that indirect cost rate. And the other thing I want to mention is if the election office may not have an indirect cost rate, but if they're part of a larger agency, they may well be part of that indirect cost for that agency. The thing we want to mention here that's interesting is with the new OMB provisions, there's a new way of at least establishing indirect cost rates for those that have never had one. And it can be used for match. A state that has never had an indirect cost rate, that means never ever, can use a de minimis fixed indirect rate of 10% of modified total direct cost. The modified total direct cost includes direct salaries, wages and benefits, materials, supplies, service, travel, and up to 25,000 of each sub-award. So if you are making sub-awards to your counties or election districts, you could include and apply this 10% up to 25,000 of the sub-award to them. One of the things that should note is that the modified total direct cost does not include equipment and capital expenditures. Equipment is defined at the federal level as $5,000 unit cost, but states can also define their own level of equipment that's less than that, and they often do. So that becomes the definition for equipment. Okay. The 10% modified total direct applies to both federal funds and match funds. The great virtue of it is simplicity. There's no indirect costs proposal, no yearly adjustments based on actual cost incurred, and it's fixed with no documentation of its cost. So make sure you're not in an department that already has an indirect cost rate, and you can consider using this automatic fixed modified total direct cost.
So now I'm going to talk about in-kind contributions. In-kind contributions are third-party donations, such as material goods, masks, cleaning supplies, equipment, anything related to mitigating the pandemic threat to voting. It could also be services. It could be donated or partially donated below cost. Finally, you could have individual volunteers that you're using for enhancing voting, and their time could be in kind. Having in-kind contribution means you also have to document that in-kind contribution. You have to determine the fair market value of the product or service. You have to know if it's feasible obtain a value statement from the donor. It is the state's responsibility to judge reasonableness. For subgrantee match, states that subgrant funds to local jurisdictions can have cost sharing, which counts toward state match. Reimbursement to local jurisdictions can also be a source of match if the state does not use federal funds to reimburse 100% of allowable pandemic-related costs. The unreimbursed amount is eligible to be matched.
So now I think we're going to open a few of the questions that we received before these two sessions. The first one is, if the state doesn't meet its matching requirement, will it have to pay all the funds back to the federal government? The answer is no. They'll only have to pay back a portion of the federal funds for which they could not meet match. So EAC's plan is to work with the states to determine the amount to return, if any, as the grants end. The second question about match is, can the matching requirement we apply to our subgrantees be used to meet the state match overall, or only the portion of the state match that would apply to that subgrant? You can apply any of the match from your subgrantee. It doesn't have to be proportionally distributed to, say, the amount of money they're giving. If they've got a larger match, that applies to the state match. And if they have a smaller match than what would be proportion, that can be used. So there is no attempt to establish a proportionality. Peg, were you going to address this one? Or
No, I think Kinza was going to, right?
Yes, I will. Sorry about that. So, question is, we bought face mask wipes, disinfecting solution for our primary that was just postponed until June. Can the state funds we use to purchase those supplies be counted as match if the emergency is over by then and we don't need them? Yes, you bought these supplies to respond to the pandemic as a preventative measure. They are still a legitimate match to the grant. The next question is, if we have an indirect cost rate that has not been negotiated in several years, can we still use it to meet the matching requirement? Yes. At this time, OMB has eased administrative requirements on grantees under the pandemic, and EAC can delay the process to negotiate a rate with grantees. You can claim the rate as part of your match and negotiate it at a later date.
So back to Mike.
oh, Peg, I thought it was back to you. Sorry. Yes, the question was, what documentation would we need if we chose to use allowable staff salaries as match? Well, you'll need to, and this is pertaining to staff salaries, you need to establish a way to document the amount of time the staff person spent on the activities supported under the grant. Generally, this would be some kind of timekeeping system that documented all the hours the employee worked and allocated hours to different cost centers, such as the CARES grant or the election security grant or other election activities. The one easy one to document is that if an employee is 100% on the grant, then their weekly paid timekeeping system would just show 100% or 100% of their hours are on the grant. These standards are set in 2 CFR 200.430, and you'll see it as standards for documentation of personnel expenses for states.
Mike, you're doing this one as well?
Okay, what was the maximum department budget amount to be able to use the de minimis 10% indirect cost percentage? If your agency receives more than 35 million in federal funds annually, you would look at the past year, you cannot use the de minimis 10%. I think in most cases, the election offices don't need that 35 million. But again, some of them are placed in other departments, so the department may.
What documentation is required for indirect cost expenses? If you have never had a negotiated indirect rate and are using the de minimis 10%, there is no special documentation to maintain. Otherwise, the documents specifying your negotiated rate serve as the documentation. Please explain the 25% limit of each subaward as it relates to indirect cost. Is that a limit of indirect cost for a particular subgrantee? The limit is actually applied on each subgrantee. The maximum amount a state can include in its modified total direct rate is $25,000 for each subgrantee. If you have one subgrantee that gets $40,000 and another that gets $20,000, the amount you can include in the calculation of the modified total direct cost is $45,000, which is $25,000 from one subaward, which is less than the 40 that you gave out, and $20,000 for the other one.
So Mike, we're back to you.
We are going to be giving subgrants to all the counties, and they will be required to provide a match that we will then use as a state match. What type of documentation do we need for the counties for their subgrant funds? And also, do the subgrants need to be expended by the counties by the end of the year? The type of documentation that you need is exactly specified in the previous citation for states in 2 CFR 200, and the documentation for personnel expenses. And then you need to have documentation for all other kinds of expenses. Some of them being fairly easy. You have invoices for services, or you have invoices for equipment. In some cases, if you're using volunteers, you need to collect their total hours, but obviously they're not keeping timesheets. So there is a variety of things that are specified in the 2 CFR for documentation. And in answer to the last part of the question, yes, you need to expend the money at the county level by the end of the year. And you may not have paid it by December 31st, and it may be paid later for bills that come due and are submitted in invoices, but it needs to be obligated and expended by the end of the year.
So now we can go to questions that you may have on the line. And we will open the chat lines. And I hear some typing, but I don't see anything yet. I'll be reading the questions, and then Kinza and Mike will be able to step in and answer them. But so far, no questions yet. And if there's anybody on a phone line that would ask a question, I'm looking here to see if we have people on phone lines, and actually there are a few. So does anyone on the phone line have a question? You can unmute your line and go ahead and ask. Nope. And no questions. Okay, everyone, we will be posting these questions and more. We received a few additional questions yesterday that we're working on full answers to, and those will be posted on the EAC website as well. Kinza or Mike, do you have anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
This is not your last opportunity to ask questions. If you think of anything else, you can email us at caresfunding@eac.gov, and we'll respond to you as quickly as we can. If you think of anything that you're working through as you are trying to implement these grants, please reach out to us at that same email and we will get back to you. Thank you so much, and good luck as you work through these challenges in this time, and stay healthy.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.